Obviously, the title of our panel is Macroeconomics in the Age of Inflation, or in Times of Inflation. We've all been watching in horror as inflation has taken a grip of the global economy. Whilst we've been observing it for some time, the other side has been in denial. At first, they told us that there was no inflation, and then they told us that it was transitory. Then they told us it was to do with COVID. Then it was a logistics crisis, and finally now apparently it's all Putin's fault. But of course what we all know is that none of this started in Wuhan or Moscow, but actually it all started in Frankfurt and Washington DC with the central bankers. So as we can see, this inflation crisis is pushing forward, and we're watching with horror as everything goes on. But to make some sense of what's going on, I've got my excellent panel here. We'll go from this side. We have Philip Thompson, who works for the Property Rights Alliance at the Americans for Tax Reform in Washington, D.C. Neven Vidakovic, who is a financial analyst and trader from Croatia, and Dan Mitchell from the Center for Freedom and Prosperity in, is it Washington as well?
Yes.
Yes. So Dan, let's start with you.
Well, thank you very much. What I want to do is share two slides that I think underscores why this is not a Putin issue or a pandemic issue. This is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Now, for those of you who don't follow monetary policy, the balance sheet simply refers to what are the assets that a central bank owns, how much do they have. And you can see that the little gray line is when the pandemic hit. So in some sense, you can say the pandemic played a big role, because it was when the pandemic hit that the Fed dramatically expanded its balance sheet, which in simple terms meant that it went out to the open market and bought up lots of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, which are the two things it tends to buy when it conducts its monetary policy. And since you're not close enough to see the numbers on the left side of the vertical axis, we basically went from a balance sheet of about $4 million. We skyrocketed up to $7 million in just a couple of months, and ever since then it's trended up now to $9 trillion. So the Fed injected a huge amount of liquidity into the system. That's the part of the blame in Washington. What about the part of the blame in Frankfurt? Well, here's the ECB's balance sheet. And you can see that for a long time, up until, say, 2014, the balance sheet was $1 to $2 trillion. Now, the European Central Bank was different than the Fed, and that they started expanding their balance sheet sooner. Was this because Draghi said we're going to do whatever it takes to keep the euro alive? What was he doing here? Was he trying to, in effect, prop up the fiscal systems of Greece and Italy and other countries? But one thing that's very clear is that once you get to the last couple of years, just like with the Fed, we saw a huge expansion of the European Central Bank's balance sheet. In this case, it went from about $4.5 trillion to about $8.5 trillion. So both central banks roughly created out of thin air $4 trillion of money. Now, let's make sure we understand. They did not create $4 trillion of economic output. They did not create $4 trillion of wealth. They took an existing economy and simply said, here's $4 trillion of extra liquidity in the system. And the purpose of this panel, I think, and I'll be very interested to hear what my other panelists say, is we have to ask why. Was it simply a fear of that the pandemic was going to cause an economic cataclysm? I mean, back in March of 2020, lots of my friends were going out and stocking up on jars of peanut butter and cans of tuna fish. You know, people didn't know whether the world was basically coming to an end and you'd have tens of millions of people dying. And so, okay, I'll give them a free pass. Central bankers back then were panicking just like everyone else, and there definitely was a big short-run hiccup in the global economy at the time. The problem is, once we got to the summer of 2020, and it was obvious that we were going to sort of be able to ride this out, even if vaccines hadn't been developed, why did the central banks continue dumping more and more money into the system. So pandemic panic maybe explains the start. Maybe they thought it was like some giant balance sheet recession like 2008 was going to happen because of coronavirus. But once we got, again, to middle of 2020, you have to wonder, and I put a question mark here because I don't know the answer, but to what extent maybe did central bankers decide that, okay, it's fun to create money, and if we create more money, that means we can buy up all the dodgy debt of Italy and Greece and other countries that otherwise would have a lot of trouble, would probably face a Greek-style fiscal crisis if they had to actually rely on private investors to buy up their debt, which of course means they would have looked at those governments' fiscal positions and said, wait, we don't trust that they're going to pay us back. But governments don't have to face that problem if they have a central bank to buy up all their additional debt. And I think that's the fundamental challenge that a lot of the world faces right now is as we unwind, at least if we do unwind, these balance sheet, what was it Warren Buffett said, when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. And I don't think the problem in the US is as severe as the problem in Europe, because I do think that countries like Greece and Italy have been swimming naked.
So let's go to Neven and perhaps talk a bit about some of this debt liquidity.
Okay.
And the bonds market.
I need a computer. I don't know. Going to behind Robert or just here. Let's do this. Okay. I want to unplug it. That's okay. I'm going to split this into three things. The first thing I'm going to tell you is how to destabilize a country financially. That's actually not that hard if you have a highly developed futures markets in government bonds. Because the way that the setup works is you have an actual cash bond, that's the market for cash where you buy and sell government bonds, and then you have a futures contract. Now to buy and sell government bonds, you need a lot of money, millions of, the US, for example, is denominated at $1 million. But if you want to do futures, you just need several $1,000s. And in between, there are algorithms that will try to arbitrage things and keep things exactly the same. Which means that if you, for example, trade futures and you just short futures and push the bond market down, the price of cash bonds is also going to decrease even if you have very low, very little volume. Now, that in the United States is almost impossible to do because of two reasons. One, the size is too big, and two, there are people who basically will, if the cash moves versus futures, will readjust the price. This is the job that I had in Chicago almost 1 million years ago in 2003. Okay. Topic one over. Topic number two. If you look at what is going on right now, everything that Professor Dr. Mitchell, I don't know how to title you, Dan said is absolutely the key. And it's the truth. In the United States, you have a monetary expansion, but they said they're going to stop it. And it was too much, and everyone recognized it's too much. But the problem is, what has happened is that Americans have a very highly developed political culture where you don't want to push policy to your successor. And Powell didn't know was he going to be nominated again to run for Fed. And he was supposed to be renominated in September, but it wasn't until December, so US is 3 months lagging. And that's why they're so behind. But the moment Powell got nominated, the first thing he said, okay, inflation is not transitory, we're going to fight inflation, and Fed started to decrease balance sheet. On the flip side, on the 30th of October, after inflation has been going up for almost 12 months in Europe, Christine Lagarde said, we have done a lot of soul searching, there is no inflation. In March, she says there is no inflation because US inflation is different from Europe inflation. Apparently, in US, if something costs $100 and goes up to 107, that is completely different from if something costs 100 euros and goes to 107. It's a different math. So things have just been going from bad to worse. Now here's the setup. Remember how I told you how to dismantle a financial system of a country? Well, here's why you cannot do it. Because in order to do it, you need to have everything lined up perfectly. So here are the things you need. You need to have really high inflation. You need to have really high government deficits and high government debt. And you need to have low interest rates as a starting point. And you need to have central bank that is constantly lying. If you are missing one of these things, you can't do anything. Because let's say that today in Europe, interest rates weren't zero, they were at 4%. Things would be completely different. Or if you had high inflation, low interest rates, but the debt was lower, you just couldn't attack a country. There would be no large enough financial movement. And also, here's another thing about Europe. Here's when they say debt versus GDP. And if you look at this, pretty much everyone looks bad, right? You have all this, Estonia and Luxembourg and Bulgaria outliners, but everyone else is a lot. But this is actually a highly misleading picture because this is a picture of relative size versus GDP. Let's do numbers. So if you look at the actual numbers, the total amount of debt is around 13 trillion euros. But the top 3 countries have 8. So the debt is heavily, heavily concentrated in only 3 countries, which is paradoxically Germany, and of course Italy and France. So here's what you do, right? You use you take a cash position in Germany, France, and Italian bonds, and you short them. And then all you have to do is short German bonds, futures, all the time. Just short them. And the prices will go down. The algorithms will then readjust the cash prices of all the other bonds, and the bond market is going to collapse. And what you're seeing for last 5 to 6 months is European bonds just going down, 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 down. And things were really okay up to last month and a half, when German 2-year shots literally went to hell. Because the 2-year bond went from negative 0.5% to positive 0.8. And this is the highest it has been in 10 years. So the bond market is already saying that they don't trust Christine Lagarde. The European Union has completely lost control over deficits. It has completely lost control over inflation, and it has actually become more profitable to damage and try to destroy the financial structure of Europe versus to support it by lending it to it because of the lack of credibility. Now, for the third part, I will have to consult my cell phone because I wrote on my blog. Everyone says that things are really cloudy. We live in a lot of uncertainty period and nobody knows what's going to happen. I know exactly what's going to happen. Everything is crystal clear, and the events will unfold really simple after the first initial move. And the first initial move is on Thursday, because Christine Lagarde has, as a true politician, has realized that she needs to switch. So from being in a coalition with inflation, saying it doesn't exist, on Thursday, she will probably, and this is the first step that it's absolutely needed for everything else to fall apart, like dominoes, she will come out and say, we need to fight inflation. And she's going to be aggressive on inflation. After that, the bond market is going to continue to drop. The deficits are going to become pricier and pricier. I mean, think about it. Germany hasn't paid interest rates on its 5-year bond in 5 years. So all of a sudden, this debt rollover is going to cost a lot more. At the same time, deficits have to go up, even if the spending doesn't. Because let's say you say, okay, all the salaries are frozen, all the investments are frozen, whatever. But you still have police cars. And police cars are using up more gasoline. You still have government building with electricity, that it's costing more. And on top of that, so the deficits just have to expand. The politicians will do the only thing they can, which is they will try to prop up the economies by actually spending more and increasing deficits for social purposes, the interest rates will rise, and then the banks will start to have a problem. Meaning that my friend who lives in Vienna got a 20-year mortgage at a fixed rate of 0.9%. That's a great deal. Nailed that. So sooner or later, because of inflation going up, demand for money goes up. And as demand for money goes up, your liabilities in a bank will start to go up, and her loan is going to become unprofitable for the bank. So what's the bank going to do? It's going to hedge using futures markets, pushing the interest rates even higher. Because everyone, all the banks in Europe are going to be on the same side of the market. It's kind of like everybody wanting to buy, nobody wanting to sell, except this is the reverse. Everybody will want to sell, there will be no buyers. After that, the inflation is basically going to become ingrained. The expectations are going to shift up, and inflation will feed back into 70s style stagflation, and it will decrease economic growth, which we're not saying it's going to be catastrophic, like a decrease of 10% in GDP, but there will be no positive growth, and banks will be again hit with a credit risk because in Zagreb, they're lending for house builders for an apartment for 3,500 euros, where average salary is 1,500 euros per month. So you basically have a feedback loop, and then we're going to have within 6 months to a year that all the positions of politicians are going to flip. They're going to say, oh, we cannot spend anymore, we need to decrease government spending, and then all of a sudden you have a blowout of aggregate demand, and Europe is going to move from high inflation to pretty much deflation we had in 2013, 2016. And since euro is so ingrained, it cannot fall apart, it cannot explode, the only thing left is to implode, which basically means we're going to have 13-16 period style economics for about 5 to 6 years until all the real production, real economic variables, real income is so depressed that you can move back up. So basically, that's how things are going to work out. If on Thursday she comes out and says, we're going to fight inflation really hard. So, and considering everything she's done so far, Christine Lagarde hasn't let me down once. So no reason to break tradition. And what people are failing to realize is that I know this, and I have a small office in Zagreb. Imagine what people who are truly smart, like Goldman Sachs, knew 6 months or a year ago. And on top of that, the world with, I don't know if you heard about GameStop and all the meme stocks, right? Well, the next meme is going to become Euro and German government bonds. Because even in Croatia, there's like an underground subculture of traders where 300 of us talk about what to do and what to trade all the time. So Europe is going to come under massive speculative hedge fund attack. And that's already happening because if you look at the rollover in futures contract, at the end, there's a huge volume where all the hedge funds exit a position. So you had that 3 months ago, you had that a week ago. So everything is really lined up for things to become really, really profitable if you are short European bonds and short economy. And this is, I'll end on a kind of a personal note. If things do get bad, this is going to be really good. It's going to be really good for us. Well, for me, it's going to be good for 2 reasons. One, I'm going to make money. But second reason is there are alternative ideas. One of the things that we are truly missing in Croatian language is we do not have a word for accountability. We have a word for responsibility, but we do not have a word for accountability, which we translate as having consequences for your actions. And once the accountability of all of this and everything that Dan showed comes to light, somebody will have to pick up the pieces. And basically, that'll be us. Because when things get bad, it's always people like, I don't know, her, that has to pick up the pieces as bad as it gets. So that's it for me. I don't know how long I talked. I thought it was going to be longer. It's going to be longer.
It came from the heart. Philip, do you want to pick up on some of that?
Thanks for the crystal ball and investment advice, Neven. I want to talk about how some of this plays out on the ground, especially in the United States, where right now, it's hard to keep track, but we have a supply chain. Everything's blamed on the supply chain instead of on inflation. So we have a solar panel shortage, a housing shortage. We have shortage on baby formula, a shortage on cars. And how this kind of unfolded in the United States is really as explained with pumping money into the people's pockets that created artificial demand. For instance, with chips in cars and car shortages, there was a time where car companies ordered less cars. There's only a few million orders that were delayed as workers stayed home from their factories. But at the same time, the government supported people to stay home. About half of the people that received COVID unemployment were making more money staying at home than working. It comes to about $900 a week or $50,000 a year, which is enough for a whole down payment on a house or a car, which are the two things Americans spend the most on. And so naturally in the market, there's more chips that are needed in cars or in washing machines or fridges. So the demand's already there naturally, and companies are producing more of those things. And then when people got extra money, they demanded more, and that demand was inflated. And then what happened was, if you look at the numbers right now, car sales are up. They're back on trend where they were before the pandemic. And chips, the United States makes most of the chips that we use are made in the United States. It's actually the one thing, if you want to know what does America make, we have we export more chips than we're importing. We only import 6% of our chips come from China, so we have an export surplus. So we see that, and also car imports and car part imports are where they have been on trend before the pandemic. So if you look at those numbers, you see that there's no shortage there. People are just buying more stuff. We're buying more cars, we're buying more houses, we're buying more fridges because they have more money, and that more money was artificially injected into their pockets through the government. And I can answer any questions or go on.
Yeah, so in effect, what we're seeing on the macroeconomic policy could best perhaps be described as, should we call it a post-COVID Keynesian consensus emerging on both sides of the Atlantic with central banks and so on. So perhaps we should have a look at what kind of policies exist to be able to roll back some of that. What do we need to see changing in order to start fighting inflation properly? You know, we've got midterms coming up in the States. What should the Republicans do when they retake Congress in November? We'll start with Dan.
Well, it doesn't matter who controls Congress, it matters who controls the central bank, and I do think Powell belatedly is moving things in the right direction. Here's the challenge, and I don't think you need to be an Austrian school economist to agree with this. You set the stage for economic bad times when you have the false boom of easy money. We've had the false boom of easy money, now everyone's scrambling, thinking, can we somehow have a soft landing? And I don't know, maybe somehow, some ways, at some points in history, omniscient and brilliant central bankers figure out how to sort of gradually withdraw the excess liquidity, shrink the balance sheet without an economic downturn. Of course, the Austrians would say that there were distorted interest rate price signals and malinvestment, so Austrians are especially skeptical of whether or not you can have a soft landing. But whatever the case, you're going to have a period of either of a recession or some very slow growth and some economic dislocation. I almost feel sorry for Joe Biden in this, because all this monetary easing, this balance sheet expansion, happened in early 2020, or at least that's when the bulk of it happened. Biden wasn't president yet. Now, would we have done the same thing if he was president? I'm sure we would have, because Democrats historically are even more dovish on inflation than Republicans. And of course, Trump being a populist, he was dovish on inflation. So we've had a perfect storm of irresponsible, short-term oriented politicians, and now the chickens are coming home to roost, to mix my metaphors.
Neven, what does the European Commission need to do then?
I would just like to expand on this. Here's their play. This is the play Fed has. Fed wants to become, for the markets, financial markets, invisible, and as soon as possible. And that's why they said they're going to start real slow with the balance sheet decrease, but from September it's going to be 100 billion, which is a lot considering the expansion was 120. and they're going to blitzkrieg the interest rates rise. So we had a quarter, half, half, and then in September maybe another half or quarter, and Powell was going to say, we're done. Now there are two elements that they're trying to say, not telling people how they hope the soft landing is going to occur. First of all, the liquidity in the economy is not going to decrease, no matter how much money they pull out, because the banks have done a reverse repo with the Fed to the tune of $2 trillion, meaning the banks have given money back to the Fed in amount of $2 trillion. So as long as that's positive, we're not even talking about normal monetary policy, let alone restrictive. So that $2 trillion, basically, portion is going to be absorbed by a decrease in the Fed's balance sheet. But here's what they hope for the second portion. When the interest rates go up, the lending actually increases, because the lending demand the demand curve looks like this. It's like a sickle. So if you have 0 to about 1.5%, banks don't want to lend. They don't want to lend because it's not profitable, because the net interest income cannot cover cost of bad loans. So as your interest rates go up to about 2%, banks turn up and say, let's do it. And that's what you had. They learned that the last time. The last time interest rates rose from 2016 to 2018, small and medium business lending actually went up. And they're hoping that this extra money, the $2 trillion, portion takes away by the Fed of $2 billion, but economic growth and employment is basically, money is pushed to the real economy instead of the stock market. And that's their play. That's the play that they have in saying, we're going to have a soft landing. But they don't want to say that openly, because then you create hope and you give up your card versus the market. As for the Europeans, they have to acknowledge the truth, which is politics cannot solve everything, and you cannot run a deficit. Christine Lagarde hasn't increased interest rates this far because she needed Macron to win her election. If you run a monetary policy by appeasing politicians, you're going to have a mess. So what you need is, again, you need to increase interest rates so the banks want to lend. You need to decrease deficits so that people like me say, well, if they're decreasing deficits, they don't need money. There's no point in me shorting the bonds. So the market will back away. And then you need to decrease regulation, and European Commission needs to understand what Americans beautifully frame as regulatory framework. Create a frame and leave everything inside to the market forces. Who jumps outside of the frame, outside of the wall, he goes to jail because he's a bad guy. And this is the expression. Whenever you listen to American presidents, they always say regulatory framework. They never say structural reforms. Because structural reforms in Europe are like, okay, Tyler, your hands here and your cell phone's here. As the British would say, that's mental. So that's the switch in terms of the actual philosophy of the policy that needs to happen. And then maybe things would get a little better in Europe. But are they going to get bad? Yes.
Can I add one thing, because I didn't answer part of your question, and this reminds me.
Historically, the Keynesians had this view that you can sort of use monetary and fiscal policy to offset each other. So if you're doing monetary tightening, as they would describe it, you can do fiscal easing or loosening. Well, the problem is we already have trillion-dollar deficits today. And there's actually a fight even inside the Democratic Party between what I would call the sort of the rational left, the Larry Summers types, and sort of the crazy left. It's not as if they're explicitly modern monetary theory type people, but their policies are almost like that. But when you have trillion-dollar deficits already, and you have this Keynesian perspective, well, you're already doing lots of so-called stimulus on the fiscal side. So what are you going to do when you decide to do monetary tightening? Are you going to go to $2 trillion deficits? I think even Joe Biden would hesitate about that, and I certainly don't think there's any political appetite to do that right now. It's yet another reason why I almost feel sorry for Biden, because it's not as if he understands any of this himself. He's just a hack politician who's been in Washington for, 49 years. But he's sort of caught up in these events that, of course, his side has been in favor of, so it's not as if I feel too sorry for him.
Philip, do you want to come in?
Sure. I'll add that, as we discussed, even though inflation doesn't come from supply chains, broad-based trade liberalization can play a role in reducing the harm inflation causes on people's pocketbooks. The Peterson Institute has been ahead on this, and they've estimated right now there's about 610 billion extra trade tariffs on American goods from Buy America, steel and aluminum tariffs, China tariffs, and anti-dumping countervailing duties. By reducing by 2% the trade equivalent tariff across the economy could reduce inflation by 1.3 percentage points, which if inflation is at 2%, that's really could make a big difference in real economic growth if you give Americans back their own money, because that's just from taxes they paid on those goods. And then, in addition, what we don't need is more spending, especially in this space, to fix these small problems. But we do have the Competes Act in Congress that commits $50 billion of money to the semiconductor industry, even though already there's this big market, a competitive market in the States. There's a $20 billion plant being built in Ohio, a $30 billion plant being built in Texas. Venture capital in that space is only about $2 billion, so committing $50 billion can take away that market, that competitive market. At the same time, there's a competing bill in Europe to commit $40 billion to semiconductors in Europe. South Korea is committing $450 billion to their semiconductor industry. And so what we should do is avoid that kind of competitive, who can support this critical industry the most, and acknowledge that the markets are doing the right thing.
And let me just give me a split second. What Dan said is the ultimate trap. This is the true danger for the United States in order not to achieve soft landing. Look at this. This is the budget deficit and data. And Americans have a strange fiscal year. Their fiscal year is from October. So if you look at this year, this is data up to April, the deficit is only $360 billion. While at the same time in fiscal year, it was almost $2 trillion here. So what you're basically seeing, this is the Fed's play. The Fed wants to control the interest rate by basically government not producing bonds, not financing deficit, because the deficit is going to be really small, and Fed is going to flood the market with bonds by decreasing their balance sheet. So that's their play. That's the only play they have. Now, what are the politicians are going to say? Look, we have no deficits. And what does that mean? And as long as that doesn't happen, things are going to play out nicely. But if someone looks at this number and says, but deficit is like 1.5% of GDP and our budget is almost balanced and we have a huge rise in employment, which means more tax dollars, and our spending is actually decreasing, the spending decreased by $700 billion because of COVID, and then COVID spending stimulus decreased. But someone says, okay, we have eliminated deficits, so why not have them again? To buy political favors for November, then it's going to be bad. Because then people like me are going to say, okay, the Americans are not playing by their own playbook, let's short their bonds. But as long as these numbers look this good, with all the other forces, if they realign, America, I'm actually really optimistic on Americans. Like Buffett would say, never bet against America, if he said that, or Reagan, I'm not sure. They're looking good. Europeans, even with the high inflation, which is highly good for tax revenues from VAT, France and Italy still have 5.5% of GDP of deficit. Whoa, that's dangerous. So it will be interesting to see this interplay.
I know that we're running down the clock a bit, so I perhaps open the floor to any questions from the audience.
Yeah, I'd like to play devil's advocate a bit to you, Daniel. You mentioned that at the beginning of the pandemic, the US government pushed a giant amount of fiscal stimulus out into the economy because they thought that maybe it will be like 2008, a giant recession. Now, this didn't happen. Maybe it didn't happen because of this stimulus, I don't know. But what I'm thinking about is kind of an asymmetrical situation here. Because if you get this very, very big recession, you get this permanent loss of output. But if you do too much stimulus, which I think most people can agree that they actually did, worst case, what do you get? Well, you get what we got now, a lot of inflation. And then you only have to do a big hike in interest rates. And worst case, you get the kind of recession which you avoided previously, or maybe even a bit smaller. What's wrong with my argument here, what do you say?
Well, I guess it depends what you think is actually stimulus. I don't think more government spending is stimulus. I don't think pumping money into the economy is stimulus. At best, it's like a sugar high, where you think you have more wealth simply because you have more dollars, but if those dollars, there's no equivalent increase in economic output, I think it's all illusory. And since I have that perspective of not believing in Keynesian stimulus, it's kind of hard for me to answer that question because it presupposes that I do agree that exists. I suppose the one thing I would add to that, and this ties into what was just said, the appetite in Washington, I think, is very limited now for a new round of Keynesian fiscal policy. Yes, the deficit this year is a lot smaller than last year because this huge multi-trillion-dollar one-time pandemic spending is going away. But even the folks on the left, at least the Larry Summers serious types on the left, they're looking at the fact that structural deficits are still $1 trillion, and they're projected to increase dramatically over the next 10 years. We just have a new Congressional Budget Office forecast that came out about that. Not to mention the fact that it's a 50-50 U.S. Senate. 50 Republicans definitely won't go along with a new Joe Biden spending package, and I'm pretty sure that there are a couple of Democrats that won't do that either. So I just, even if I was a Keynesian and I believed that these were good ideas, I would assign very, very low probability of anything happening. Republicans are happy to waste money when there's a Republican president. They sort of get this fake religion of fiscal responsibility when there's a Democrat in the White House asking for the new spending.
Yeah, thank you.
What is wrong with your thinking is stock market. I'm just trying to pull up the data, but my time's up. In 2012, Apple had zero long-term debt. I think now has, don't quote me, 150 or 200 billion dollars of long-term debt. None of that money was used for any kind of real economic purpose except for stock buybacks. So as many authors have shown, even in one of the books about COVID-19 that I edited, a lot of that cheap money did not go into real economy. It remained in financial economy, where companies just issued debt and bought back their own stocks, pushing their own stocks up. McDonald's had negative capital to the tune of $4 billion. So did Boeing. So what's the purpose of conducting a company by saying we're returning the value to the shareholders by issuing debt and then buying stocks? So what is the problem with Keynesian economics? It had an assumption that's actually shortened. Investments equals savings. That's not true. It is savings equals deposits. Deposits equals credit. Credit equals investments. This relationship broke down the moment savings started to be used for issuing debt to buy back stocks. So you need to push money back into the real economy for investments. And that's why this reasoning, everything you said is correct in logic, except it's incorrect in the connection with the real world because you didn't ask yourself how much of this stimulus is going to the real economy and how much of this stimulus is going to the stock market so someone can get a bonus because of the price of shares going up. That's the breakdown of logic.
Philip, any advance on that, on stimulus spending?
Not on stimulus spending.
Okay, well, yeah, that's...
Yeah, can I ask about the geographical distribution of inflation? I mean, you talked about Europe and the United States. What about Japan? They have relatively small inflation, while very excessive government debt to GDP. Also very, huge balance sheet of the central bank. And then geographical distribution of inflation within Europe. We see different countries having, different levels of inflation. What are the causes and consequences? And perhaps also about the US. I mean, I assume that different regions have different levels of inflation in the US. And at the same time, the US obviously has a bigger factor mobility than Europe. Sorry, lots of questions basically about geography and distribution of inflation.
The Japan and Switzerland, I believe I read just today, have inflation of about 2.5%, while the overall average for the U.S. and the Eurozone is 7 to 8%. Now, there's always volatile prices in an economy, but without monetary fuel from central bank inflationary policies, prices going up in one sector are offset by prices going down in another sector. And I assume that's true inside the United States, even with inflation going on. They're probably going up in some areas where the sectors are seeing more supply chain disruptions or whatever, and the same is probably true in Europe, although I confess, other than hearing a few anecdotes here and there, I just don't know the details about what's happening in Europe. But we've always had regional recessions and booms in the United States, depending on what industries are doing well, what sectors are benefiting or getting hurt by government policy.
Neven, quickly.
The Japan, everything that happens in Japan is due to demographics, because their demographic pyramid looks like this. I've read back when it was in a paper edition, I don't read it anymore now, that's in digital, and I read in Playboy that 30% of Japanese men under 30 have never had sexual intercourse. So there's basically, their country is dying. So it doesn't matter how much money you do. In order to start an inflation, you basically need to do a kind of helicopter money that Americans did. You bypass the financial sector, you take the money and you give it to the people, they spend it, that's inflationary boost. In terms of Europe, here it is, the dispersion is really large, and this is one of the factors that Europe cannot solve and it has to solve. Because if you look at this data, for example, in Lithuania, inflation is 15%, in Germany it's 7%, meaning that if I produce this glass in Lithuania for 100 euros, it now costs 115. Well, in Germany it costs 107. So the real exchange rate is a huge problem for this. Now, one of the solutions for this is basically do what Fed did, which is there are no state central banks. There are regional banks that are carved up United States. Europe needs to destroy their central banks, and Europe needs to be carved up, meaning that if you have two regional central banks, they cannot be, Germany as a whole and France as a whole cannot be in one of them. You have to split Germany, you have to split France, you have to split Italy, so that national ceases to exist in the conduct of monetary policy. And that might be a path to achieving a better monetary, non-political monetary policy. Will that ever be done? No. And that's why the real inflation is never going to be solved, and that's why you're going to have that Germany is a black hole of Europe. And just like any black hole, it sucks everything in, the labor, capital, investment, and the periphery is going to suffer, and that's why in Croatia all the factories are basically going under, and we only do tourism, which is our comparative advantage, which is, again, a problem for any kind of equality or any kind of convergence or any kind of economic stability in Europe.
Well,
can add that as far as trade liberalization goes, there's a few things to watch. Next month is our first tranche of China tariffs are due to expire. And we expect that the administration will ask them to continue. But in order to do that, the U.S. Trade Representative has to make a report to justify them. And we already have on record from this administration, the previous one, is that they haven't worked and they haven't been strategic. So we expect a conversation to start next month about how we can be more strategic with our tariffs. And in addition, in the Competes Act, it's expected that there will be a demand from Congress that the Trade Representative have a tariff exclusions process that's transparent. So we're beginning to have a conversation in the States, if you're really optimistic, on how do tariffs work and how do you use them effectively, which might lead to trade liberalization.
Well, there was a lot to unpack there and a lot for classical liberals, and especially those who believe in the Austrian School of Economics, to think about going forwards. But I'm afraid that we've run out of time, so that all that really remains is to thank Philip, Neven, and Dan for their participation in this panel, and to thank you for being a good audience. So thank you so much.